I didn't find out the way people expect. There was no scream, no confrontation, no phone thrown across the room. It was a Tuesday, not even a memorable one. The kind of day that doesn't feel important until years later, when you realize it quietly split your life into before and after. I was standing in my kitchen, barefoot, holding a mug that had already gone cold. I remember that detail because I hate cold coffee, always have. But I didn't notice. That should tell you something. Before I tell you what I found, you need to understand who I was before it happened. I wasn't naive. I wasn't desperate. I wasn't someone who ignored red flags because I was afraid of being alone. I was calm, stable, thoughtful. The kind of person who believed trust wasn't loud. It was steady. The kind that didn't check phones, didn't ask questions twice, didn't imagine betrayal where there was no proof. And for a long time, there really was. We'd been together just over 6 years. Not the movie kind of love. The quiet, grown-up kind. Shared routines, shared bills, inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else. The kind of relationship where nothing dramatic happens, and you take that as proof that it's real. If you'd asked me that morning if I trusted my partner, I wouldn't have hesitated. I would have laughed and said, "Of course." That's what makes what came next so unsettling. Because betrayal doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives calmly, softly, almost politely. The message wasn't meant for me. It popped up on the tablet we shared, the one linked to the same account. A notification that lingered half a second longer than it should have. A name I didn't recognize. A heart emoji. A sentence that ended with "last night." That was it. One line. One breath. I didn't open it. I just stared. There's a strange moment right after something like that happens, where your brain protects you by offering explanations. Maybe it's a coworker. Maybe it's a joke. Maybe I'm misreading it. I remember thinking, don't overreact. That sentence would come back to haunt me later. I locked the screen and went about my day like nothing had happened. I answered emails. I folded laundry. I even smiled when my partner walked in that evening and kissed my cheek. And I hated myself for how normal it felt. That night, lying in bed next to them, I stared at the ceiling and felt something shift inside me. It's not anger. Something colder. Uncertainty. I didn't sleep much. Over the next week, I didn't investigate. That might sound strange, but it was intentional. I wanted to know if my gut was lying to me, or if I was finally listening. So I watched. I noticed how their phone never left their side anymore. How they tilted the screen away, just slightly. How certain names never came up in conversation. Still no explosions. Still no accusations. Just quiet data points collecting in my head. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from suspecting someone you love. You don't want to be right. You also don't want to be wrong. Because either way, something breaks. One evening, about 2 weeks later, I asked casually, "Who's Alex?" I didn't raise my voice. Didn't change my tone. They froze. Not dramatically. Just enough. A half-second pause. And then, "Oh, just someone from work." I nodded. But something inside me tightened. That night, I waited until they were asleep. I told myself, I was just looking to reassure myself that I needed closure more than truth. I picked up the phone. I wish I could say my hands were shaking. They weren't. I scrolled slowly. Messages, photos, plans. Not explicit, not graphic. Worse, intimate, familiar. The kind of conversations that grow quietly between two people who think they're being careful. I sat on the edge of the bed, the glow of the screen lighting up a life I didn't recognize anymore. They'd been seeing each other for months. In months. I didn't cry. I didn't wake them. I put the phone back exactly where it was. And that's when something unexpected happened. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. A strange calm settled over me. Because now I knew. And knowledge changes things. The next morning, I kissed them goodbye like always. I said, "Have a good day." And I meant it. Not because I forgave them, but because something in me had already begun to detach. I didn't confront them that week, or the next. I started writing. Not messages. In notes. Dates, times, patterns. I paid attention to what they told me and what they didn't. I watched how easily lies slid into conversation. How comfortable they were rewriting reality. And here's the part that's hard to admit. I let it continue. Not because I was weak. Because I was thinking. I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. Not just the affair, but the person. There's a moment in every betrayal story where people expect the victim to act. I didn't. I waited. And that decision, that quiet patience, would change everything. But at the time, all I knew was this. The person sleeping beside me every night was living a double life. And I was the only one who knew. That silence was heavier than any argument. I started asking myself questions I'd never asked before. Who are you really? How long have you been capable of this? And what happens now that I see you clearly? I didn't know it yet, but the story had already shifted direction. Not toward confrontation, toward something slower, something intentional, something that would unfold over time, quietly, carefully, until one day the truth wouldn't just be known. It would be unavoidable. And when that moment came, nothing would be the same. Silence changes shape when you carry it long enough. At first, it feels like weight. Something pressing on your chest when you wake up. Something that makes ordinary conversations feel rehearsed. But over time, silence hardens. It becomes structure. I learned that in the weeks that followed. Nothing outward changed. We still cooked dinner together. Still argued lightly about meaningless things, groceries, laundry, what to watch at night. Still slept in the same bed. If anyone had looked at us from the outside, they would have seen stability. What they wouldn't have seen was the quiet separation happening inside me. I stopped sharing small things, the random thoughts, the half-formed worries, the jokes that didn't quite land. Those had always been ours. Now they stayed with me. There's a strange grief in realizing intimacy doesn't disappear all at once. It leaks out slowly. And the person you're grieving is still alive, still smiling at you, still asking how your day was. Sometimes they asked if something was wrong. I'd shrug and say, just tired. which wasn't a lie. I was exhausted, not from anger, from control. Every instinct in me wanted to confront them, to throw the truth onto the table and demand explanations that wouldn't satisfy me anyway. But something deeper told me to wait, not out of cruelty, out of self-respect. I wanted to understand what this betrayal meant, not just emotionally, but practically. What kind of future was I dealing with? What kind of person lies this smoothly? And what happens when they're finally exposed? So I observed. I noticed patterns. The affair wasn't chaotic. It was organized. Planned lunches that ran long. Work trips that weren't on the calendar before. Phone calls taken outside. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a choice repeated. That realization hurt more than the affair itself. Because mistakes can be forgiven, patterns mean intent. One night, while they were in the shower, I stood in the hallway and listened to the water running. I remember thinking how ordinary everything sounded. Like this could continue forever if I let it. And that's when I understood something important. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's about timing. I started protecting myself quietly. I separated finances subtly, stopped contributing to joint accounts under the guise of budgeting, made copies of important documents, not because I planned to destroy anything, but because I planned to survive whatever came next. At the same time, I worked on myself. That part doesn't get talked about enough. Everyone thinks revenge begins with plotting. For me, it began with rebuilding. I started going to the gym again. Not obsessively, just enough to feel strong. I reconnected with friends I'd drifted from. Carefully, casually. I didn't tell anyone what was happening. This wasn't about validation. This was about control. And control comes from being steady. There were nights I almost broke. Moments when they laughed at something on their phone, and I felt the urge to ask, "Is it worth it?" But I swallowed those words. Because I was learning something powerful. They didn't suspect me at all. They thought they were careful. They thought they were smarter than me. And that false sense of safety would matter later. Weeks passed, then months. The affair deepened. So did my clarity. One evening, they told me they were thinking about a change. Not directly, just testing the idea in the air. Sometimes I wonder if people just grow apart, they said. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. That surprised them. They were looking for resistance. Instead, they found calm. That night, after they fell asleep, I sat in the dark and felt something settle inside me. Not rage. Resolve. I realized something important then. This wasn't about punishing them. It was about letting their own choices speak. And when they did, I wanted the truth to land in a way they couldn't escape. So I waited for the moment where exposure would hurt the most, not emotionally, but existentially. The moment when their carefully built image would collapse under its own contradictions. I saw Arted documenting everything, not obsessively, methodically. Dates, contradictions, promises broken in real time. I kept it factual. No insults, no commentary, just truth. And truth, when presented cleanly, is devastating. There's a strange power in watching someone lie when you already know the truth. You stop feeling small. You start seeing clearly. One afternoon, I ran into someone unexpectedly. A mutual friend. They mentioned seeing my partner with someone new. Casually, innocently. I smiled and said nothing. That was when I knew the secret was no longer contained. The story was leaking, which meant timing mattered more than ever. I didn't want rumors. I wanted reality. Clean, undeniable, self-inflicted. So I planned the exit. Not dramatically. Quietly. I lined up a new place to live. Made sure my finances were independent. Prepared conversations in my head without rehearsing them out loud. And then came the turning point. The moment that changed the direction of everything. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a discovery. It was an invitation. They told me they were going away for the weekend. Another trip. Another's lie. I nodded. But this time, I didn't feel numb. I felt ready. Because while they were gone, I made a decision. Not about revenge. About truth. And once that door opened, there would be no going back. I didn't know yet how viral this would become. I didn't know how many people would eventually hear my story. All I knew was this. I had stayed silent long enough. And silence had done its job. The house felt different once they left. Not empty. Exposed. Their suitcase stood by the door for a moment before they picked it up. I watched them tie their shoes. Watched them check their phone, smile at something I wasn't meant to see. They kissed my cheek like always. Nothing dramatic. That was the part that stayed with me. How normal betrayal can look. The door closed. The lock clicked. And for the first time in months, I was alone with the truth without having to hide it. I didn't cry. I sat down at the kitchen table and let the quiet settle. There's a moment after someone leaves where you can still feel their presence. The air remembers them. But slowly, the space becomes yours again. That's when I opened my laptop. Not angrily. Not shaking. Calm. I reviewed everything I had gathered. Messages. Dates. Contradictions. I wasn't building a weapon. I was building clarity. The revenge wasn't going to be explosive. It was going to be precise. Because I didn't want them to suffer emotionally. I wanted them to understand. There's a difference. I started with something small. I updated my social presence. Not dramatically. No quotes. No cryptic messages. Just honesty. I posted a photo of myself at a cafe later that day. A place I hadn't gone to in years. The caption was simple. Choosing peace. That was it. It wasn't aimed at anyone. But it unsettled them. I knew it would. Because when someone thinks they're controlling the narrative, silence terrifies them more than anger. That evening, they messaged, "Is everything okay?" I replied, "Yeah, just enjoying the day." Nothing more. That was the first crack. Over the next few days, I changed the rhythm of my life. I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I didn't respond instantly. Didn't ask follow-up questions. Didn't mirror their energy. I became distant. Not cold. independent. And independence reads like danger to someone living a lie. They came back from the trip restless, less confident. They talked more, over-explained things I didn't ask about. I listened. I always listened. At some point, they said, "You've been different lately." I looked at them and said, "I think I'm just paying attention." They laughed nervously. That laugh told me everything. That night, while they slept, I packed a bag. Not everything. Just enough. The next morning, I told them I was going away for a few days. They didn't like that. They asked where. I said I need space to think. The word space scared them. I could see it. And I didn't comfort them. Because comfort is a privilege you earn through honesty. I stayed with a friend. I didn't explain everything. I just said, something broke, and I need to decide what to do with the pieces. They understood. People always do when you stop lying to protect someone else. While I was away, I made the real decision. I wasn't going to confront them privately. Not yet. Because private confrontations allow manipulation. Tears. Excuses. Rewriting history. I needed the truth to exist outside of just the two of us. Not publicly, but clearly. I reached out to someone who mattered. Someone whose opinion shaped how others saw them. A family member. Not with accusations. With facts. I asked for a meeting. When we sat down, I didn't dramatize anything. I spoke slowly. Calmly. I found out about the affair, I said. It's been going on for a while. I'm not asking you to take sides. I just need you to know the truth before decisions are made. They were quiet for a long time. Then they asked questions. I answered them. Simply. That conversation changed everything. Because once the truth leaves the relationship, it grows. I didn't tell friends yet. I didn't post anything else. I let the truth move on its own. When I returned home, my partner was tense. They could feel the shift. Something had moved beyond their control. They asked, "Did you tell anyone?" I looked at them and said, "I told the truth to someone who asked." That wasn't a lie. That night, they tried to confess. Not fully. Just enough to test my reaction. "I've been confused," they said. I didn't mean for things to go this far. I listened. Then I said, "Confusion doesn't last for months." Silence filled the room. For the first time, they didn't have a response. That's when I knew the power had shifted. Over the next week, consequences started appearing quietly. Family tension. Awkward conversations. Plans being questioned. Not because I exposed them publicly, but because lies don't survive light. They started asking for forgiveness. Real forgiveness. Not performative. And for a moment, I considered it. Not because they deserved it, but because I was tired. Revenge is exhausting if it's fueled by anger. That's when I understood the final shape of what I was doing. This wasn't about destroying them. It was about letting them sit inside the reality they created. So I made the last move. I told them I was leaving. Not angrily. Not dramatically. I said, I can't live in a story that isn't true. They begged. They promised change. They cried. and I believed they were sincere. But sincerity after betrayal doesn't undo damage. It just acknowledges it. I moved out permanently. And that's when the story took a turn neither of us expected. Because once I left, people started asking questions. And the truth, now free, began answering them. I didn't announce my departure. I didn't post a statement. Didn't explain myself. Didn't ask anyone to understand. I just left. And that absence spoke louder than anything I could have said. At first, people assumed it was temporary. A break. A misunderstanding. They'd seen us together for years. Comfortable, predictable, stable. No one questions stability until it collapses. My ex tried to control the story. They always had. They told people I was overwhelmed, that I needed space, that things were complicated, but we were working on it. They said it with confidence. That same confidence they used with me. But this time, the confidence cracked because I wasn't there to back it up. And silence, when paired with truth, creates curiosity. People started reaching out to me quietly. Not aggressively. Not gossip hungry. Concerned. You okay? Heard you moved out. Did something happen? I answered carefully. I didn't accuse. Didn't dramatize. I said things like, I found out something that changed how I saw the relationship. I needed to step away. I'm taking care of myself. That was it. No details. But humans are pattern seekers. And patterns were forming. Especially because my ex didn't stop talking. They over-explained. Every time someone asked a question, they added another layer. Another justification. Another version. Stories don't survive when they have too many drafts. The first real fracture happened at a family gathering I wasn't invited to. I found out later. Someone asked where I was. My ex gave their rehearsed answer. And someone else said, calmly, that's not what I heard. Just that. No accusation. No argument. But the room shifted. Because once doubt enters a space, it doesn't leave quietly. It rearranges everything. I didn't hear about this directly. It came to me in fragments. A message from a cousin. A call from a mutual friend. A pause in someone's voice. People weren't choosing sides yet. They were choosing awareness. My ex felt it. They called me late one night. Not angry. Afraid. People are talking, they said. I could hear it in their breathing. That same fear I'd lived with for months. I said, people talk when they sense dishonesty. They went quiet. Then they said something I didn't expect. I never thought you'd let this happen. That sentence told me everything. They still believed I was responsible for managing the consequences of their choices. I wasn't anymore. I didn't raise my voice. I said I didn't make anything happen. I stopped preventing it. After that call, they tried something new. They tried remorse publicly. Sudden vulnerability posts. Reflections. Mentions of growth and mistakes without specifics. It was almost impressive. But people can tell when remorse is curated. Because real regret doesn't perform. It retreats. The more they tried to appear changed, the more questions surfaced. Why now? What triggered this transformation? Why wasn't this effort made earlier? And then came the moment I didn't plan for. The moment that pushed the story beyond our circle. Someone shared my cafe photo. The one that simply said, "Choosing peace." They shared it with a caption I didn't write. Sometimes peace comes after truth. I didn't ask them to remove it. I didn't comment. But that post traveled. Not explosively. Slowly. Like a rumor that feels too true to ignore. People began connecting dots. And when people connect dots, they don't need explanations. They need confirmation. My ex lost control, not because I spoke, but because I didn't. They tried reaching out again. This time desperate. "We need to talk. You're letting people believe things." I replied, "I'm letting people believe what aligns with reality." That was the last direct conversation we had. After that, things unraveled on their own. Invitations stopped. Plans changed. People became distant. Not cruel, just cautious. Trust doesn't disappear loudly. It withdraws. I watched this from a distance, not with satisfaction, with a strange, heavy calm. Because revenge, when it's quiet, doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like gravity. Unavoidable. Impersonal. The hardest moment came when someone asked me directly, "What really happened?" We were sitting across from each other. No phones. No audience. I took a breath, and I told the truth. Not emotionally. Factually. When I finished, they didn't react immediately. They just said, "That explains everything." That sentence mattered more than any apology I never got. Because understanding is closure's quiet cousin. By then, my ex's other relationship had collapsed. Affairs don't survive exposure. They survive secrecy. Without me to anchor the lie, everything fell apart. They tried to come back. Not romantically. Narratively. They wanted to clarify things. To reset the story. But stories don't reset. They settle. And once settled, they don't move for anyone. I didn't block them. I didn't lash out. I simply stopped responding. Because my silence now had a different weight. It wasn't submission. It was finality. And then something unexpected happened. Someone I didn't know reached out. They said they followed the situation from the outside. They said my quiet strength helped them leave something toxic. They said my restraint gave them permission to stop explaining themselves. That message sat with me for days. Because I never intended to inspire anyone. I just wanted to survive with my dignity intact. But apparently, restraint resonates. And that's when I realized something else. This wasn't just my story anymore. It had become a mirror for others. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar. Betrayal rarely looks like chaos. It looks like routine. And revenge rarely looks like destruction. It looks like truth removing its disguise. By the time my ex tried one last public gesture, it was too late. No one reacted. No one engaged. Indifference had replaced judgment. And indifference is the most complete consequence of all. I didn't feel victorious. I felt done. But closure doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in layers. And the final layer hadn't surfaced yet. Because even after everything fell apart for them, there was still one conversation left. One truth I hadn't said out loud. Not to them. To myself. When everything finally went quiet, I didn't feel relief. I felt exposed. For months, my focus had been outward. Managing distance. Holding my tongue. Watching consequences unfold without interfering. But once the story stopped moving, once there were no more updates, no new reactions, no fresh ripples, I was left alone with myself. That was harder than betrayal. Because anger gives you something to hold on to. It gives shape to pain. Silence doesn't. I woke up one morning and realized no one had mentioned them in days. Not casually, not indirectly. It was as if the world had quietly agreed to move on. And suddenly, I had no role to play anymore. I didn't need to be strong, or composed, or patient. I just needed to exist. That's when the questions started. Not the dramatic ones. The small, relentless ones. Who am I when I'm not reacting to someone else's damage? What parts of me were built around containment, not desire? How much of my life was shaped by avoiding discomfort instead of choosing honesty? I went back to places we used to go. Not immediately. Only when they stopped feeling dangerous. The grocery store. The park. That cafe. I watched couples argue over nothing. I watched people sit in silence together without tension. And I realized something uncomfortable. I hadn't been happy for a long time. Not just near the end. For years. I had mistaken stability for safety. Routine for intimacy. Loyalty for love. And in doing so, I'd participate. In my own quiet erasure. That realization hurt more than the affair. Because it meant I wasn't just betrayed. I was complicit in staying somewhere that no longer fit. I started therapy. Not to process the cheating, but to understand why I stayed so long after things stopped feeling mutual. I talked about control, about fear, about how being needed can feel like being loved if you don't know the difference. One session, the therapist asked me a simple question. If nothing had happened, how long would you have stayed? I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth arrived fully formed. Forever. And that scared me. Because it meant the affair didn't destroy my life. It interrupted it. It forced a reckoning I was avoiding. I didn't forgive my ex. Not formally. Not ceremonially. But I stopped needing them to understand what they did. That need dissolved quietly. One day, I realized I hadn't thought about them at all. Not with anger. Not with curiosity. Just absence. That's when I knew I was healing. People still bring them up sometimes. Less now. But occasionally. I listen. I nod. I don't add anything. Because my story doesn't need defending anymore. The viral part of this story happened without me noticing. Someone told me later. They said people were sharing it. Talking about restraint. About dignity. About choosing truth without spectacle. I never posted the details. I never claimed moral superiority. I just stepped aside and let reality breathe. That's not power. That's surrender. And surrender, I learned, isn't weakness. It's refusal to keep carrying what isn't yours. The last time I saw my ex was by accident. Across a room. They looked smaller. Not physically. Internally. They noticed me. I could tell they wanted to approach. To say something. Anything. I met their eyes. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply acknowledged their existence. And then I turned away. That moment felt complete. Not dramatic. Just final. There was no revenge left to take. Only space to live. I don't tell this story to teach anyone how to hurt someone back. I tell it because silence is often misunderstood. People think it means weakness, or fear, or avoidance. Sometimes it means you're choosing not to poison yourself just to prove you were wronged. Revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like refusing to carry someone else's shame any longer. If you're listening to this and you're waiting for a moment where everything feels resolved, it might not come the way you expect. It might arrive quietly, on a morning where nothing hurts sharply anymore, on a day where your past doesn't ask for your attention, on a breath that doesn't feel guarded. That's when you'll know. Not that you won, but that you're free. Freedom doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly. So quietly that, at first, you don't trust it. After everything ended, after the story stopped circulating, after my name stopped being attached to theirs, I waited for something else to happen. Some emotional aftershock. Some delayed regret. Some sudden collapse. It didn't come. Instead, life continued. That was unsettling. I'd spent so long preparing myself for impact that the absence of it felt wrong. Like standing on solid ground after a long storm and still bracing for waves that never arrive. People assume revenge ends with a high. Mine ended with a calendar full of ordinary days. Work. Errands. Sleep. At first, I felt disappointed by that. Not because I wanted drama, but because part of me had built an identity around endurance. I had been the one who survived betrayal. Now that label no longer applied. And I didn't know who I was without it. I started noticing how often I framed myself in reaction to the past. I don't trust easily because. I need space because. I'm cautious because. Every sentence began with an explanation. One afternoon, a stranger asked me something simple. What do you like doing? Not what do you do? Not where are you from? What do you like? I froze. Not because I had no interests, but because I'd forgotten how to answer without qualifying it. I said something vague. They nodded politely. The conversation moved on. But that moment stayed with me. That night, I wrote a list. Not of goals. Not of healing milestones. Just preferences. Things I liked. Things I didn't. No justification. No context. It felt childish at first. Then it felt honest. I began rebuilding my life in ways no one noticed. I rearranged my apartment. Not for aesthetics, for flow. I stopped attending events out of obligation. Started saying no without explanation. I spent time alone without calling it loneliness. That distinction mattered. Occasionally, someone would bring up my ex again. Less frequently now. But it still happened. This time, I noticed something new. I didn't tense. I didn't prepare a response. Their aim passed through the conversation like a stranger's. No heat. No pull. Just sound. That's when I realized the revenge wasn't the ending. It was the bridge. The real transformation happened after no one was watching. One day, I ran into someone who knew both of us, but not the story. They asked casually, "Didn't you two used to be together?" I said, "Yes." They waited for more. I didn't add anything. They nodded and moved on. That was enough. Later, I thought about how much effort I used to spend making sure my silence was interpreted correctly. Now I didn't care. And that felt like the final release. I didn't forgive my ex in the traditional sense. I didn't send a message. Didn't offer closure. But I stopped narrating them in my head. Stopped replaying scenes. Stopped imagining alternate outcomes. They became a chapter, not a reference point. I learned something important during this phase. Revenge that's done quietly doesn't demand applause. And healing that's real doesn't announce itself. People still message me sometimes. They say they're in the middle of something similar. They ask what they should do. I never give instructions. I just tell them this: pay attention to who you become while you're waiting. Because betrayal doesn't just reveal the other person. It reveals what you've been tolerating, what you've been silencing, what you've been calling love because you didn't want to face the alternative. If I could go back, I wouldn't stop the affair from happening. That sounds harsh, but it's true. Because without it, I would still be shrinking myself to maintain peace that wasn't mutual. I would still be loyal to something that didn't see me clearly. And I would still believe that endurance was the same thing as strength. This story went viral because people recognized themselves in it. Not in the revenge, but in the waiting, in the restraint. In the moment, you realize you're done protecting someone who didn't protect you. If you're still there, still waiting, still quiet, still unsure, know this. You don't need a dramatic exit. You don't need perfect timing. You don't need to be believed by everyone. You just need to stop lying to yourself. Everything else rearranges naturally after that. The most powerful thing I ever did wasn't exposing the truth. It was stepping out of the story entirely and choosing a life that didn't need to be explained. Years passed, not in a dramatic montage way, just quietly. The kind of passing where you don't notice the change until one day you realize your shoulders sit lower than they used to. I didn't count the years. I measured them by how little I thought about that chapter. At first, it was daily, then weekly, then only when something reminded me. Eventually, even reminders lost their edge. I moved homes once. Not to escape memories, I just needed more light. A bigger window. A quieter street. I remember the first morning there. Sunlight on the floor. Coffee cooling on the counter. Nothing special happened. And that was the point. I had learned to recognize peace by its lack of performance. People sometimes ask if I ever regretted how things ended. I always pause before answering, because regret assumes a desire to undo. And I don't. I don't miss the person I was when I was trying to make something work alone. I don't miss explaining basic respect. I don't miss the constant self-interrogation. Was I imagining it? Was I being dramatic? Was I asking for too much? I was tired back then. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes. The kind that comes from constantly editing yourself. That version of me doesn't exist anymore. I changed in small, irreversible ways. I stopped over-clarifying my feelings. Stopped softening truths to make them easier to swallow. I became comfortable letting people misunderstand me. That was new. I learned that clarity doesn't guarantee kindness, and kindness doesn't require self-betrayal. I learned that love isn't proven by how much pain you can absorb. One afternoon, years later, I ran into my ex. By accident. A grocery store. The frozen foods aisle. Of all places. We recognized each other at the same time. That pause, that half second, where your body checks for old reactions. Nothing happened. No spike. No anger. Just recognition. We exchanged polite words. How have you been? A good, you. A good. That was it. They looked older. So did I. We were strangers who shared history, but not intimacy. When I walked away, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for what they did, but for what I learned. I learned how much I could survive without becoming bitter. I learned that silence can be louder than confrontation. I learned that dignity is not passive, it's deliberate. The viral story faded into the background of my life. Sometimes someone would mention it. Most people didn't know. And I liked it that way. I stopped being the person who went through that. I became just a person. With opinions. With boundaries. With a nervous laugh I no longer apologized for. I fell in love again. Slowly. Carefully. Not because I was afraid, but because I was selective. I paid attention to how someone handled discomfort, how they listened, how they responded when I didn't agree. I trusted patterns, not promises. And I noticed something important. Love felt lighter this time. Not intense. Not consuming. Just steady. No guessing games. No self-abandonment. I could breathe. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the version of me who was still waiting. Still hoping. Still quiet. I want to tell them something. Not advice. Not reassurance. Just this. You're not weak for staying longer than you should have. You were loyal to the version of the future you believed in. But you're allowed to outgrow that version. You're allowed to leave without becoming cruel. You're allowed to choose yourself without calling it revenge. The story didn't end when the truth came out. It ended when I stopped needing the story to validate me. That's the part that never goes viral. The part where nothing explodes. Where no one claps. Where life simply opens. And you step into it. Unburdened. This is the final chapter. Not because everything became perfect, but because the past finally stopped speaking louder than the present. Understood. This isn't a reversal. It's what comes after the ending people think is the ending. There's a strange moment that happens long after closure. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with tears or anger. It comes when you realize you no longer need to tell the story. Not because it doesn't matter, but because it no longer defines the room when you walk into it. I noticed it one evening while talking to someone new. We were sharing stories. Light ones. Work, family, bad habits. At one point they asked casually, "So what was your last serious relationship like?" I opened my mouth and stopped. Not because it hurt, because I didn't know which version to tell. The long one, the viral one, the quiet truth. I gave them the simplest version. It ended because we wanted different things. And that was enough. No tightening in my chest. No urge to justify myself. They nodded and moved on. Later that night, alone, I sat with that moment. How easily it passed. That's when it hit me. Healing isn't loud. It's the absence of a reaction you once rehearsed 100 times. There are still pieces of that past inside me. They didn't disappear. They just changed function. What used to be pain became discernment. What used to be anger became standards. What used to be revenge became self-respect that doesn't need witnesses. Sometimes people assume revenge is about winning. It's not. It's about reclaiming authorship. I didn't ruin their life with exposure or cruelty. I did something quieter. I removed myself as a safety net. I stopped absorbing consequences that weren't mine. I let reality arrive without interference. And reality is relentless when you stop protecting someone from it. Years later, I heard through someone else that they were struggling. Career instability. Relationships that never lasted. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not pity. Just distance. That's when I knew the revenge had fully completed itself. Not when the story went viral, but when I no longer needed updates. I used to believe closure was an answer. Now I know it's a shift, a recentering. Life didn't reward me with fireworks. It gave me quieter gifts. Trusting my instincts without debating them. Walking away at the first sign of disrespect. Choosing calm over chemistry. And understanding that love isn't proven by endurance. It's proven by reciprocity. There's one thing I never said publicly. Something I kept for myself. I never wanted to hurt them. I wanted to stop hurting me. Everything else was a side effect. If someone listening is still waiting for the moment where the pain turns into justice, I want to be honest with you. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in fragments. The first night you sleep without replaying conversations. The first laugh that surprises you. The first boundary you hold without explaining. And one day, much later, you realize something unsettling and beautiful. If you saw them again, really saw them, you wouldn't need them to understand. Because you already do. You understand why you stayed, why you left, why you chose restraint over destruction, and why that choice quietly rebuilt your life. The story didn't make me famous. It made me free. And freedom, I've learned, doesn't announce itself. It just stays. There's a myth people carry about moving on. They think it's a door you close, a chapter you finish, a line you cross. But what actually happens is subtler. You move forward, and the past walks a few steps behind you for a while. Not chasing, not grabbing, just present enough to remind you of who you used to be. For a long time, I thought I had outrun everything. The betrayal, the planning, the restraint that hardened me. Then something unexpected happened. I saw them again. Not in person. On a screen. It was a random moment. One of those algorithm accidents. A mutual connection had posted a photo from a gathering I wasn't part of and never would be. They were in the background. Older. Thinner. Smiling in a way that didn't quite reach the eyes. I stared longer than I meant to. Not because I missed them. Because I recognized the expression. I had worn it myself once. That look you carry when you're pretending stability has returned. When you've learned how to perform okay. It stirred something uncomfortable. It's not anger. Not sadness. Responsibility. A question rose that I hadn't prepared for. Had I gone too far? It's strange how morality shows up late to conversations it avoided earlier. When I was in survival mode, everything felt justified. Now that I was calm, I had the luxury to reflect. I replayed the timeline. I didn't lie. I didn't manipulate. I didn't expose them publicly by name. I simply stopped cushioning the fall. Still, the consequences were real. Lives don't collapse loudly. They erode. And erosion leaves scars. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from regret. From recognition. I finally understood something important. Revenge isn't clean. Even the quiet kind leaves fingerprints on your soul. You don't escape untouched. You grow, but you also carry weight. The difference is whether the weight crushes you or strengthens you. I sat with that discomfort instead of pushing it away. That's something I couldn't do before. Before, I needed certainty. Now, I allowed complexity. I admitted this truth to myself. Part of me wanted them to feel what I felt. Not the pain exactly. The loss of certainty. The disorientation of realizing the ground beneath you isn't solid. And that doesn't make me a monster. It makes me human. The danger is pretending you're above that impulse. I was. I just chose not to let it drive. A few weeks later, something else happened. A message request. Their name. No warning. No context. Just the notification. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit. Hours passed. I noticed my body before my thoughts. No spike in heart rate. No rush of heat. Just stillness. That alone told me how far I'd come. When I finally opened it, the message was short. Careful. Almost rehearsed. They said they'd been thinking about the past. That they didn't expect forgiveness. That they just wanted to acknowledge the damage. No excuses. No defense. Just an attempt at something. I read it twice. Then a third time. And I realized the moment I'd imagined for years had finally arrived. The apology. The recognition. The proof that they knew what they'd done. And it felt underwhelming. Not because it was insincere, but because I no longer needed it to validate anything. This was the real test. Not revenge. Not restraint. Response. I didn't reply immediately. I took a walk. Watched strangers live their lives without knowing mine. I thought about the version of myself who would have answered instantly, with sharp clarity, with control disguised as grace. That person doesn't live here anymore. When I returned, I wrote something simple. I acknowledged the message. I accepted the accountability. And I closed the door. Not with anger, with finality. I wished them well. And I meant it in the only way that mattered. Without attachment. After I sent it, I felt something release. Not triumph. Not relief. Alignment. I had acted in accordance with who I am now, not who I was then. That matters more than any outcome. Here's what people don't tell you about revenge stories. The real ending is when the other person falls. It's when you realize you could have pushed harder and chose not to. Because power isn't proven by damage. It's proven by restraint you no longer need to prove. I don't know what they felt after my reply. I don't need to. That curiosity used to own me. Now it passes through without staying. There's one last thing to say before this story truly ends. Revenge didn't give me peace. Responsibility did. Responsibility for my healing. Responsibility for my boundaries. Responsibility for the person I became after the damage. And if this story has stayed with you, maybe it's because you're standing near that same crossroads, where you could hurt back, or you could step forward. Both paths change you. Only one lets you sleep at night. There is one final moment left to tell. Not about them. About me. About the choice that came after everything. The one that closed this chapter for good. That comes next. There's a moment that comes after every long internal war. Not a victory. Not a defeat. A quiet envy. And Tori. You wake up one day and realize there's nothing left to prove. No one left to convince. No story left to correct. Just you standing in the life that followed. For me, that moment didn't arrive dramatically. It came on an ordinary morning. I was making coffee, the same mug, the same window, the same street sounds I'd heard 1,000 times. And suddenly, I noticed something missing. The constant tension. That low-level readiness. The mental rehearsals. The background noise of what-ifs and should-haves. It was gone. Not suppressed. Resolved. I stood there longer than necessary, hand resting on the counter, realizing this was what peace actually felt like. Unimpressive. Unglamorous. Solid. People talk about closure as if it's a conversation. It is. Closure is internal permission to stop returning to the scene. And that permission can't be given by the person who hurt you, only by the person who lived through it. I didn't wake up healed. I woke up unoccupied. That's different. Healing is active. Freedom is quiet. From the outside, my life probably looked unremarkable. Work. Friends. Evenings that didn't carry urgency. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer measured my worth against what I had endured. I no longer needed the story to land a certain way. It had already landed. People sometimes ask if I regret what I did. They expect a clean answer. Yes or no. I don't give one. Because regret assumes there was a perfect alternative. There was. There was only the version of me I was, and the version I became. I don't romanticize the revenge. I don't recommend it. But I also don't shame myself for surviving the way I knew how. That compassion used to be impossible. Now it's natural. Here's the truth I avoided for a long time. The betrayal didn't break me. What nearly broke me was abandoning myself afterward. The silence, the self-doubt, the belief that being patient meant being passive. Once I reclaimed my agency, everything changed. Not because they lost something, but because I stopped losing myself. That's the part no one claps for. There's no audience for internal alignment. No applause when you choose restraint over spectacle. But that's where real maturity lives, in choices that go unseen. Weeks passed, then months. Their name became just a name again. A reference point, not a trigger. I noticed new habits forming. I spoke more honestly. I listened without waiting to defend. I left situations earlier when they felt wrong. Pain taught me boundaries. Revenge taught me consequences. But peace taught me discernment. And that's the lesson that stayed. One evening, I ran into someone who had known us both. They asked casually how things ended. I paused, not because it hurt, because I realized I could tell the story any way I wanted now. I smiled and said something simple. It ended the way it needed to. And that was enough. Because the ending wasn't about exposure. It wasn't about justice delivered loudly. It was about a quiet return to self-respect. If you're listening to this and waiting for your moment, the confrontation, the apology, the reckoning, I want you to know something. Those moments don't heal you. They only reveal where you already are. If you're grounded, they pass through. If you're still bleeding, they reopen wounds. So don't rush them. Heal first. Decide later. That's the difference between reaction and power. I didn't destroy their life. Life did what life does when truth removes its scaffolding. All I did was step aside and step forward. This story doesn't end with victory music. It ends with me choosing who I become next. Every day. Quietly. Without witnesses. And that's the ending that finally belongs to me. Some stories don't end when the damage is done. They end when the survivor stops narrating themselves through the wound. If this story felt familiar, it's because many people live it silently. And if you're still in the middle of yours, stay patient. The strongest part of you hasn't spoken yet.